He built a multi-million-dollar hip-hop empire and shattered racial barriers worldwide. Yet his reward was a bullet in a modest Queens recording studio. For 20 agonizing years, the execution of Run-DMC's Jam Master Jay remained one of music's darkest unsolved murders. Abandoned by the corporate industry he enriched and suffocated by massive IRS debts, this desperate pioneer was forced into the lethal criminal underworld just to survive. The men who pulled the trigger were his own friends, but the entertainment machine and a ruthless tax system loaded the gun. This 2-decade mystery exposes the ultimate terrifying cost of being a cultural pioneer, building an empire for others, only to be bled dry and left to face the executioner alone. The story begins in the working-class streets of 1970s New York, an era defined by municipal neglect and economic decay. Born in Brooklyn in 1965 and raised in Hollis, Queens, Jason Mizell did not grow up with the safety nets afforded to the American elite. Hollis was a neighborhood of hard-working families, fiercely trying to hold the line against the encroaching devastation of the crack cocaine epidemic. Survival here required a sharp mind and an acute awareness of your surroundings. For a young black boy in this environment, the pathways to generational wealth were not just narrow, they were virtually non-existent. The traditional avenues of corporate America were walled off by systemic racism. You survived through sheer grit and occasionally through extraordinary talent. Jason Mizell possessed that rare, undeniable talent. Long before he touched a turntable, he was a musician. By the time he was a teenager, he had mastered the bass, the guitar, and the drums. He understood the fundamental architecture of rhythm. In the late 1970s, as the sound of hip-hop began to echo out of the Bronx and into Queens, most people heard noise. Jason heard a new framework for music. While early rap records relied on live studio bands playing polished disco and funk grooves to back up the vocalists, Jason recognized that this glossy production did not reflect the harsh, concrete reality of the streets. He walked every day. He knew the music needed to sound like the environment that birthed it, aggressive, raw, and unapologetic. When he aligned with his childhood friends Joseph Simmons and Daryl McDaniels in the early 1980s to form Run-DMC, Jason became the structural engineer of their sound. He took the moniker Jam Master Jay. He stripped away the live R and B bands. He brought the aggressive, percussive scratching of vinyl records and the heavy, punishing kicks of the Oberheim DMX drum machine directly to the forefront. When they released their debut singles in 1983, the impact was seismic. It was a hostile takeover of the airwaves. It did not sound like anything else on the radio because it was not designed to please the traditional gatekeepers. It was designed to bypass them. However, bypassing the cultural gatekeepers does not mean bypassing the financial ones. As Run-DMC's popularity exploded, they were pulled into the boardrooms of Manhattan. This is where the true silent violence of the music industry occurs. In the 1980s, the recording industry was a monolithic, white-dominated corporate structure. They viewed hip-hop not as a legitimate art form, but as a profitable temporary urban fad. More importantly, they viewed the young, unrepresented artists from neighborhoods like Hollis not as equal business partners, but as cheap, disposable, raw material. The contracts handed to young hip-hop pioneers were essentially documents of indentured servitude, dressed up as golden tickets. When an artist signed a deal, the label provided an advance. To a kid from a working-class neighborhood, a check for tens of thousands of dollars felt like lottery wealth. But it was an illusion. The advance was a high-interest loan. The system operated on a predatory accounting practice known as cross-collateralization. The record company recouped every single expense associated with the artist: the studio time, the manufacturing of the vinyl, the promotional flights, the music videos, and even the catering directly out of the artist's meager percentage of the royalties. The cruelty of this system lies in its design. The label owned the master recordings, meaning they owned the actual asset that would generate money for decades. The artist only received a fraction of the sales, and only after the label had paid itself back for every risk it took. A group like Run-DMC could sell millions of records, generate massive transformative revenue for the corporate entity, and still technically owe the label money on paper. The industry exploited the artists' lack of financial literacy and their desperate desire to escape poverty. The executives knew these young men did not have high-powered entertainment lawyers reviewing the fine print. They capitalized on the desperation of the inner city to secure permanent ownership of a new global culture. For Jason Mizell, the psychological burden of this new reality was immediate and immense. He was not just the DJ of Run-DMC, he was the street anchor. While Run and DMC were the vocal frontmen, Jay was the silent authority. He provided the credibility. With that credibility came a crushing sense of obligation. In neighborhoods starved of resources, when one person makes it out, they do not make it out alone. They become the primary economic engine for their entire extended family and their community. Jason embraced this role willingly, but the weight of it began to warp his reality. He was suddenly expected to be the provider, the employer, and the savior for dozens of people. He bought houses, he paid for local funerals, he funded businesses for his friends. He was living the expected lifestyle of a global superstar, maintaining the image that the fans and the label demanded. But the cash flow feeding this lifestyle was fundamentally compromised by the predatory contracts he had signed. He was building an empire on top of a financial sinkhole. The trauma of being a provider in a neglected community is rarely discussed in the context of celebrity. The psychological terror of knowing that if you fail, if your record stops selling, your family goes back to poverty, creates a permanent state of hypervigilance. Jason could not just be a musician. He had to be a hustler, constantly moving, constantly trying to generate capital to feed the machine he had inadvertently built around himself. The music industry provided the illusion of infinite wealth, but it offered zero financial education and zero long-term security. They gave him a microphone and a check, but they kept the deed to the house. As the 1980s progressed, Run-DMC achieved unprecedented milestones. They were the first rap group to earn a gold album, the first to earn a platinum album, and the first to have their music videos played on MTV in heavy rotation. They broke down doors that had been locked for generations. But every time they knocked down a door, a corporate executive stepped over the threshold to collect the toll. Jason Mizell was orchestrating a cultural revolution from behind two turntables, completely unaware that the financial architecture he was trapped within was slowly, quietly beginning to collapse. The genesis of Jam Master Jay is a testament to the undeniable power of street-level genius. He took the discarded tools of a forgotten borough and weaponized them into a sound that conquered the globe. He elevated his friends, his family, and his culture out of the shadows. But the tragedy of the pioneer is that they are so focused on clearing the path forward, they rarely see the traps being set behind them. Jason Mizell had survived the physical dangers of Queens, only to walk directly into the quiet, lethal exploitation of corporate America. He had earned his fame, but he did not own his future. The era of golden chains and sold-out arenas was blinding, masking a terrifying reality. The moment the music stopped, the corporate safety net would vanish, leaving him alone to face the absolute brutality of the American financial system. The 1990s arrived not with a celebration of Run-DMC's foundational legacy, but with a cold, abrupt dismissal. In the entertainment business, cultural relevance is an incredibly volatile currency, and the exchange rate can plummet overnight. The sonic landscape of hip-hop was shifting rapidly. The aggressive, minimalist drum machine beats that Jason Mizell had perfected were suddenly competing with the cinematic, funk-driven gangsta rap of Los Angeles, led by Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg, and later the gritty, complex mafioso narratives of the Wu-Tang Clan and the Notorious B.I.G. in New York. Hip-hop was maturing, expanding into new, darker territories. But rather than elevating the founders to the status of elder statesmen, the music industry categorized Run-DMC as a nostalgia act. They were no longer the vanguard. They were history. This is the precise moment where the structural cruelty of the music business becomes glaringly apparent. In a traditional corporate sector, a founder who builds a multi-billion-dollar market from the ground up is rewarded with equity, board seats, and a lucrative retirement package. In the music industry, you are merely a product with a shelf life. When your sales metrics drop, you are liquidated. There is no pension plan for a cultural pioneer. There is no safety net provided by the record labels who built their empires on your back. The executives who purchased summer homes using the profits generated by Walk This Way and My Adidas simply stopped answering Jason's calls. The psychological whiplash of this sudden irrelevance is profound. Jason Mizell was a man in his late 20s, possessing a brilliant musical mind, trapped in an industry that told him his best days were already behind him. But the true trauma lay in the brutal disconnect between his public image and his private reality. When Jason walked down the streets of Hollis, Queens, the community did not see a struggling artist. They saw Jam Master Jay, the global icon. They saw the man who had beaten the system. With that perception came an unrelenting, suffocating pressure. The entourage, the childhood friends, the extended family, and the local businesses, they all still looked to Jason as the primary economic engine. In marginalized communities, the expectation placed on the one individual who makes it out is absolute. You are expected to be the bank, the employer, and the savior. Jason, deeply loyal to his roots, refused to abandon his people. He continued to pay for local funerals. He continued to employ his friends. He maintained the facade of the wealthy superstar because the alternative, admitting that the corporate machine had chewed him up and spat him out, was a public humiliation he could not bear. It is a very specific, terrifying brand of psychological torture. Being famous enough to be recognized on any street corner in the world, but lacking the liquid capital to maintain the lifestyle the world projects onto you. Jason was managing a collapsing empire, trying to hold the walls up with sheer willpower. Then, the second far more dangerous machine entered the equation: the Internal Revenue Service. If the music industry is ruthlessly indifferent, the federal tax system is clinically lethal. The American tax structure is fundamentally not designed to accommodate the erratic, highly volatile income of a recording artist. When an artist receives a massive advance or a sudden royalty check, taxes are rarely withheld at the source. The artist is handed a lump sum and expected to manage the liability. for young men in their 20s, surrounded by managers and accountants who frequently prioritize their own exorbitant fees over the artist's long-term security tax payments, are routinely mismanaged, deferred, or outright ignored. By the mid-1990s, the IRS placed a massive, unavoidable bullseye on Jason Mizell. He was hit with tax liens approaching $500,000. The system of federal taxation does not care about your cultural impact. It does not care that your record label utilized predatory cross-collateralization contracts to drain your royalties. It does not care that you are single-handedly supporting dozens of people in an impoverished neighborhood. The IRS applies crippling financial penalties and compounding interest, creating a vortex of debt that grows exponentially faster than a declining artist can realistically earn. Jason Mizell was now caught in a fatal vice grip. The legitimate high-paying avenues of his career were being systematically closed off by the recording industry, while the federal government was threatening to seize his remaining assets, his home, and the homes of his family members. The IRS does not negotiate with fading fame. It simply forecloses on it. To combat this escalating terror, Jason made a desperate pivot. He refused to be relegated to the nostalgia circuit. He knew he had an exceptional ear for talent, so he poured his remaining resources into establishing his own recording facility, 24/7 Studios, located on Merrick Boulevard in Jamaica, Queens. He intended to transition from a performer to a mogul. He would use his studio to discover, mentor, and produce the next generation of hip-hop artists. This was not merely a business venture, it was a bid for survival. 24/7 Studios became his sanctuary and his fortress. It was here that he discovered a young, raw, and highly controversial rapper named Curtis Jackson, later known to the world as 50 Cent. Jason took Jackson under his wing, teaching him the mechanics of song structure and studio discipline. He was trying to build a new roster, trying to create a legitimate, sustainable revenue stream that could finally satisfy the IRS and secure his family's future. But running a professional recording studio in New York is an exceptionally expensive endeavor. The equipment upgrades, the lease, the engineering staff, and the constant influx of local talent expecting free studio time created a massive monthly overhead. Jason was bleeding cash. The revenues from his new artists were not materializing fast enough to outpace the compounding interest of his federal tax debt. The walls were closing now and the corporate executives were gone. The IRS agents were at the door and the community was still waiting for their paychecks. Jason Mizell, the architect of a billion-dollar industry, was being pushed to the absolute edge of financial ruin. When the legitimate avenues for survival are systematically dismantled, a desperate man is forced to look toward the shadows. To keep the lights on at 24/7 Studios and keep the government from taking his mother's house, Jam Master Jay would have to make a decision that would ultimately cost him his life. The physical space of 24/7 Studios on Merrick Boulevard was meant to be a sanctuary. Behind its heavily fortified doors, the chaos of Jamaica, Queens, was supposed to fade, replaced by the meticulous, controlled environment of audio engineering. For Jason Mizell, the studio was a command center for his second act. It was here that he poured his remaining capital, attempting to build an independent empire that the major labels could not touch. He was acting as a producer, a mentor, and a father figure to a revolving door of young, hungry artists looking for a way out of the neighborhood. But a sanctuary is only safe as long as the walls hold. And the walls of 24/7 Studios were actively crumbling under the weight of financial strangulation. The brutal mechanics of a frozen financial identity drove Jason's agonizing choices in the late 1990s. When the Internal Revenue Service places a six-figure tax lien on an individual, it does not merely ask for a monthly check. It executes a comprehensive financial paralysis. Bank accounts are frozen. Credit lines are abruptly terminated. The ability to secure a standard business loan, a mortgage, or even a basic line of credit for studio equipment is entirely revoked. You are locked out of the formal American economy. Yet, the daily operating costs of a professional recording facility do not pause for federal audits. The lease must be paid. The electricity required to run massive mixing consoles must be paid. The studio engineers, security personnel, and the hangers-on who relied on Jason for their daily survival required cash. How does a man with frozen bank accounts and a publicly scrutinized profile generate the massive amount of liquid capital required to keep a business afloat and a community fed? When the formal banking system excommunicates you, the informal, unregulated street economy becomes the only lender of last resort. This is the grim, unspoken reality of the environment. The transition from cultural icon to narcotics broker was not driven by a sudden embrace of the criminal lifestyle. It was driven by the cold, calculating mathematics of survival. Jason Mizell was a man who had spent a decade campaigning against gang violence. He had traveled the world preaching positivity and urging the youth to use education and art to escape the streets. The cognitive dissonance required to step from that podium into the shadows of the drug trade is a psychological trauma of its own. It requires a man to systematically dismantle his own moral framework simply to protect his family from eviction. Historical investigations and subsequent federal indictments laid bare the devastating truth. Jason began to leverage his most valuable remaining asset, his extensive nationwide network. Years of global touring had provided him with connections across the country. He did not stand on a street corner selling grams. He operated as a high-level logistics broker. He connected wholesale suppliers in the Midwest with distribution networks on the East Coast. It was a business of connecting dots, moving bulk product, and extracting a middleman's fee. In many ways, it utilized the exact same logistical skills required to route a national concert tour, but the commodity was illegal, and the penalty for failure was lethal. The tragedy of this descent is rooted in Jason's fundamental nature. He was an artist and a provider, not a cartel enforcer. The narcotics trade is an entirely unforgiving ecosystem. In the legitimate business world, if a distribution deal falls through or a partner breaches a contract, you file a lawsuit. You take the grievance to a judge. In the black market, there is no judicial recourse. Discrepancy, stolen product, or perceived disrespect cannot be litigated. They must be settled with violence. This is the fundamental law of the street economy. It demands a level of sociopathy and a willingness to commit brutal acts to enforce boundaries and protect investments. Jason Mizell lacked that inherent ruthlessness. He was known throughout Queens as a peacemaker, a man who would talk a situation down rather than escalate it. He believed that his legacy, his universal respect, and his status as Jam Master Jay would act as an invisible shield in the underworld. He assumed that the rules of the street, where predators ruthlessly devour the weak, would be suspended for him because of what he had done for the culture. This was a fatal miscalculation. The drug economy does not respect past musical achievements. It does not care that you broke racial barriers on MTV. It only respects leverage, intimidation, and the capacity for violence. By stepping into this arena, Jason placed himself in a highly vulnerable position. He was swimming in shark-infested waters, wearing a suit of armor made of past glories. He was brokering deals involving hundreds of thousands of dollars, dealing with hardened criminals whose entire existence was predicated on violence and paranoia. And he was doing it all while trying to maintain the facade of a successful, legitimate music executive during the daylight hours. The strain of living this dual existence began to show. The studio, once a place of pure creative joy, became a tense, guarded environment. The people coming through the doors were no longer just aspiring rappers. They were associates from a much darker world. The atmosphere thickened with paranoia. Jason was juggling the demands of his young artists like a young 50 Cent who was drawing his own dangerous attention from local rivals, with the terrifying logistics of moving kilos of cocaine across state lines to appease the IRS and keep his mother in her home. He was a man running out of runway. The tax debt was a ticking clock. The studio was a financial black hole, and the underground deals were becoming increasingly complex and dangerous. The corporate industry had long since turned a blind eye, perfectly content to profit off the Run-DMC back catalog while the group's architects slowly drowned. The government simply waited for its money, indifferent to how it was procured. The system had successfully cornered him. He was trapped in a room with no legal exits, forced to play a game where the only outcomes were federal prison or the morgue. As 2002 approached, the deals grew larger, and the margins for error disappeared. Jason was desperately trying to put together one final massive transaction. The goal was to generate enough liquid cash to finally clear the IRS debt, secure the studio's future, and walk away from the black market forever. He was trying to buy his life back. But in the underworld, attempting to walk away is often the most dangerous move a man can make. The trap was set, and the predators were already inside the building. The narrative of the fallen star often places the blame entirely on the individual's hubris, but the descent of Jam Master Jay demands a harsher indictment of the structures surrounding him. Driven to the brink of foreclosure by predatory contracts and crippling tax debts, Jason took a desperate, fatal gamble in the underground economy to save his family. Jason Mizell was a desperate man backed into a corner, forced to choose between the immediate destruction of his family's livelihood and the lethal risks of the shadow economy. He chose the risk, driven by a misplaced belief that he could outsmart a world built on violence. He believed he was brokering his salvation. He did not realize he was negotiating his own execution. The intersection of the music business and the criminal underworld is a landscape defined by absolute, unforgiving volatility. In the corporate sector, a failed negotiation results in a severed contract or a civil lawsuit. In the shadow economy that Jason Mizell was forced to navigate, a failed negotiation is a capital offense. By the autumn of 2002, the financial pressure from the Internal Revenue Service had reached a critical mass. Jason was not merely trying to maintain a lifestyle, he was desperately trying to prevent the federal government from dismantling his family's remaining security. This desperation pushed him into orchestrating a transaction that was far beyond the scope of his usual survival tactics. Federal indictments and historical investigations later revealed the fatal architecture of this final deal. Jason had allegedly leveraged his connections to acquire approximately 10 kilograms of cocaine from a supplier based in the Midwest. The objective was to transport the product to Baltimore, Maryland, where it would be distributed through a designated network. It was a massive, high-stakes logistical operation designed to generate a sudden, substantial influx of liquid cash. However, a catastrophic fracture occurred within the chain of command. An associate named Ronald Washington, a man Jason had known for years, was reportedly slated to handle a portion of the Baltimore distribution. A dispute arose and the Baltimore connections refused to work with Washington. Consequently, Jason made the executive decision to cut Washington out of the transaction. In a legitimate business environment, removing an underperforming or unwanted partner from a distribution deal is standard practice. In the narcotics trade, severing a man's revenue stream and publicly diminishing his status is interpreted as an act of profound disrespect. It demands a lethal response. The underworld does not possess human resources departments or arbitration boards. It relies on violence to maintain order and enforce boundaries. Jason, whose fundamental nature was that of a peacemaker and an artist, fundamentally misread the severity of the situation. He believed his status as Jam Master Jay, his history of community generosity, and his lifelong relationships would insulate him from retaliation. He was operating under the tragic assumption that the men around him still viewed him as a cultural icon. They did not. To them, he was simply a vulnerable obstacle in a lucrative supply chain. On the evening of October 30th, 2002, the false security of 24/7 studios was shattered. The studio on Merrick Boulevard was meant to be an impenetrable fortress, a place where Jason could create music and escape the mounting terrors of his financial reality. That evening, the lounge area was occupied by a handful of friends, employees, and artists. It was a relaxed atmosphere. Jason was sitting on a sofa, playing a video game, taking a brief respite from the crushing weight of his dual life. At approximately 7:30 p.m., the studio buzzer rang. The security protocols, usually strict, were fatally relaxed. 2 men were granted entry. They walked up the stairs and entered the lounge. One of the men was Ronald Washington. The other was Carl Jordan Jr. The presence of Carl Jordan Jr. is the most harrowing, psychologically devastating detail of the entire tragedy. Jordan was not a faceless hitman hired by a rival cartel. He was Jason Mizell's godson. He was a young man whose family Jason had supported, someone who had grown up under the protective umbrella of Jason's generosity. When Jordan approached, Jason did not reach for a weapon. He did not attempt to flee. Witnesses reported that Jason actually stood up and smiled, extending his arms to embrace the young man he had helped raise. Carl Jordan Jr. raised a .40 caliber handgun and fired at point-blank range. One bullet struck Jason in the head, killing him instantly. A second bullet struck an associate in the leg. As the legendary architect of hip-hop collapsed onto the floor of his own sanctuary, the 2 assassins calmly turned, walked down the stairs, and vanished into the Queen's night. The execution was swift, cold, and intimately personal. The immediate aftermath of the assassination exposed a secondary, deeply entrenched, systemic failure, the impenetrable wall of silence. When the New York Police Department arrived at 24/7 Studios, they found a crime scene that defied logic. A world-famous musician had been executed in a confined space containing multiple eyewitnesses, yet the detectives were met with absolute uniform silence. Nobody saw anything. Nobody knew anything. This refusal to cooperate is frequently dismissed by outside observers as mere criminal complicity, a stubborn adherence to the stop snitching code. However, for an older audience seeking the root causes, this silence must be understood as a profound symptom of systemic trauma. The individuals in that studio did not remain silent simply to protect the killers. They remained silent out of a paralyzing, historically justified terror. In marginalized communities, there is a deeply ingrained belief that the police cannot and will not protect witnesses from retribution. Furthermore, the witnesses knew precisely who the killers were. They knew these men were embedded in their own community. To speak to the police was to invite an immediate death sentence upon themselves and their families. The system had failed to protect Jam Master Jay, and the survivors had zero faith that it would protect them. The investigation instantly hit a brick wall, paralyzed by fear and institutional distrust. While the police struggled with a silent community, the corporate music industry reacted with a display of staggering, stomach-churning hypocrisy. The news of Jam Master Jay's murder sent shockwaves across the globe. MTV interrupted its programming to play continuous tributes. News networks ran extensive retrospectives on the legacy of Run-DMC, and suddenly, predictably, the record sales spiked. The back catalog of Run-DMC, which had been languishing for years, surged to the top of the charts. The corporate executives who had refused to return Jason's calls, the men who had discarded him when the cultural wind shifted, were now issuing press releases expressing their profound grief. They praised his genius. They celebrated his barrier-breaking achievements. But they offered absolutely no structural support to the family he left behind. The industry happily monetized his martyrdom. In death, Jam Master Jay was once again a highly profitable asset. Yet, as the record labels collected the sudden influx of royalty revenue, Jason's widow and children were left to face the horrific reality of his financial collapse alone. The Internal Revenue Service does not forgive debt in the event of a tragic death. The tax liens remained. The threat of foreclosure remained. The industry that had built its multi-billion-dollar foundation on Jason's drum breaks did not establish a fund to clear his debts or secure his family's future. They simply packaged his tragedy into a compelling narrative to sell more greatest hits compilations. The death of Jam Master Jay became a cold case almost immediately. The years turned into a decade, and then 2 decades. The silence in Queens held firm. The pioneer who had given a voice to an entire generation was reduced to an unsolved file in a police precinct. His murder sat alongside the killings of Tupac Shakur and the notorious B.I.G. as a grim testament to the lethal intersection of entertainment and street culture. But unlike those rivalries which were fueled by public egos and media manipulation, Jason's death was uniquely tragic because it was born entirely of silent, desperate financial suffocation. He was not a gangster seeking glory. He was a father trying to pay a federal tax bill. The murder of Jason Mizell in the autumn of 2002 was not merely a physical assassination. It was the violent culmination of a multi-tiered institutional betrayal. The recording industry extracted his youth, his innovation, and his earning potential, only to discard him into the unforgiving machinery of the IRS. The tax system, blind to nuance and devoid of mercy, systematically stripped away his legitimate avenues of survival, pushing a peaceful man into a violent arena. And finally, the very community he had poured his life and resources into produced the men who pulled the trigger. As the world mourned the loss of a cultural icon on television, the actual reality of his final days was buried under police tape and corporate press releases. The legend of Jam Master Jay was secured, but the man himself had been entirely consumed by the systems that fed off him. The long, agonizing wait for justice had only just begun. For nearly 2 decades, the murder of Jason Mizell sat in a filing cabinet in Queens, a glaring open wound on the history of American music. As the years ticked by, from 2002 into the 2010s, hip-hop transitioned from a dominant musical genre into the undisputed center of global pop culture. Corporations that had once hesitated to play Run-DMC on television were now minting billionaires out of rappers. Yet the man who had laid the concrete foundation for that multi-billion-dollar empire remained an unsolved homicide. His killers walked the same streets he had once tried to uplift. His family was left to navigate a world without a father, without a husband, and without the financial security he had desperately died trying to protect. The silence that followed the execution at 24/7 Studios was not born of apathy. It was a highly effective mechanism of survival. For years, the New York Police Department and federal investigators hit a stone wall. The witnesses who were inside the studio lounge that night were paralyzed by the threat of violent retribution. They understood a grim reality that observers outside the neighborhood often fail to grasp. The police conduct interviews and then drive back to the precinct, but the witnesses have to stay in the neighborhood. They have to live next door to the killers. When the justice system is perceived as unreliable, silence becomes the only life insurance policy available. It took the formidable, slow-moving machinery of the federal government to finally break the deadlock. Federal prosecutors possess tools that local police do not. They can offer witness protection, relocation, and immunity deals that span across state lines. They can also bring the crushing weight of federal narcotics charges to bear on associates, forcing them to cooperate. Slowly, painstakingly, over the course of 18 years, agents dismantled the narcotics network that Jason Mizell had tragically entangled himself within. They traced the supply lines to the Midwest. They tracked the distribution routes to Baltimore, and they secured the testimonies of those who had been in the room. In August 2020, the United States Department of Justice unsealed an indictment. They arrested Ronald Washington and Carl Jordan Jr. The news sent a shockwave through the music industry, but for those who had been paying attention to the mechanics of the street, the revelation was deeply sickening. The men who had assassinated Jam Master Jay were not anonymous hitmen from a rival cartel. They were his inner circle. Washington was an old friend who had lived on Jason's couch. Jordan was his godson. The trial, which finally commenced in early 2024, stripped away any remaining romanticism surrounding the music business or the criminal underworld. The courtroom testimonies laid bare the absolute mundane desperation of Jason's final days. He was not a kingpin. He was a financially terrified father trying to broker a 10-kilogram cocaine deal simply to keep the Internal Revenue Service from taking his family's homes. During the trial, the prosecution detailed how Jason had acquired the narcotics on consignment. When the Baltimore distributors refused to work with Washington, Jason cut him out of the deal. Washington, feeling disrespected and deprived of a lucrative payout, conspired with Jordan to execute their benefactor. The court heard the chilling details of how the two men entered the studio, exploiting Jason's trust. They heard how Jason had stood up to embrace his godson, only to be shot point blank in the head. The motive was not a grand cinematic rivalry. It was a dispute over a narcotics transaction valued at roughly $200,000. It is a profoundly disturbing figure. Jason Mizell had generated hundreds of millions of dollars for record labels, television networks, and footwear conglomerates. Yet, because of predatory contracts and the unyielding penalties of the tax system, his life was violently ended over a sum of money that a corporate music executive might spend on a single promotional campaign. In February 2024, a federal jury found both Ronald Washington and Carl Jordan Jr. guilty of murder while engaged in a narcotics trafficking conspiracy. The convictions brought a sense of legal finality to a 22-year-old cold case, but the justice delivered in that Brooklyn courtroom was inherently hollow. It held the men who pulled the trigger accountable, but it did nothing to address the systemic forces that had loaded the weapon. The trial did not subpoena the record executives who had pocketed the majority of Run-DMC's earnings. It did not cross-examine the accountants and managers who had allowed a young artist to accrue massive tax liabilities. It did not scrutinize the IRS for utilizing a penalty structure that mathematically guarantees the ruin of individuals with highly volatile incomes. The legal system prosecuted the street-level execution, but the corporate and institutional abandonment that drove a cultural icon into the hands of his killers remained entirely legal, unpunished, and business as usual. When we look back at the life and death of Jason Jam Master J. Mizell, we are forced to confront the darkest mechanisms of American capitalism. The narrative of the self-made celebrity often ignores the structural traps designed to extract wealth from the creator and transfer it to the corporation. Jason Mizell suffered the ultimate pioneer penalty. He and his group cleared the jungle. They broke the racial barriers of mainstream broadcasting. They proved that hip-hop was a viable, globally marketable commodity. But pioneers are rarely the ones who inherit the empire. Because they operate in uncharted territory, without the protection of strong unions, equitable legal precedents, or financial literacy, they are vulnerable to extreme exploitation. The industry took Jason's youth, his innovation, and his cultural credibility. When his commercial viability dipped, they discarded him. They left him alone to face a tax system that operates with algorithmic cruelty. Jason's fatal mistake was believing he could outsmart a violent underworld to solve a corporate financial crisis. He believed his generosity and his legacy would protect him in an environment that only respects leverage and lethal force. His death was a tragedy of immense proportions, but it was not an accident. It was the predictable outcome of a system that views artists from marginalized communities as disposable raw materials. Jam Master Jay gave the world a new rhythm. He provided the soundtrack for a cultural revolution that continues to dominate the globe today. The billions of dollars generated by modern hip-hop artists owe a direct, unpayable debt to the turntables in Hollis, Queens. But as those billions change hands, his story remains a stark, permanent warning. It is a testament to the absolute ruthlessness of the entertainment machine, a machine perfectly willing to watch its greatest architects die in the cold, so long as the music keeps playing and the profits keep rolling in.